I'm presuming we can go to a second round of questions. So, Fáilte, you're very welcome. Thank you for attending. I should say at the outset, just to declare my interest, I did postgraduate studies in the University of Limerick. So I'm certainly not going to question the excellence of your academic endeavours.
One of our most valued alumni.
Thank you so much. And flattery, Professor, will get you nowhere, as you will discover. Discuss the finances, the financial arrangements of the university, and as you've outlined in your opening statement, there are several elements to that. I want to talk to you at this stage about your expenses system. I want to ask you, Professor, you accept that UL has to play by the rules, don't you? I mean, you made reference to the funding constraints of the last decade. You said quite correctly that the highest standards of governance must pertain to the use of public monies. Can I put it to you that that has not been the practice in the University of Limerick, specifically as regards expenses and the administration of expenses on your watch?
I do not accept that judgment on your part. I think in the briefing paper I indicated the actions of the university in which are consistent with the commitments I made in my opening statement to introduce process improvements and clarity around allowable expenses back in 2010.
How long are you in position? I'm aware that there was a change in system in 2010, but I'm also aware, and your briefing document makes reference to 3 specific individuals, named A, B and C, who came forward with really astonishing complaints in respect of what they described as almost like a VIP system in terms of how expense claims were awarded. So I want to put it to you very directly, Professor, that these allegations were extremely serious and they represented, at best, systems failure or confusion, and at worst, corruption within the system in the university.
Well, I think we will have to make a distinction between person A, who last worked in the university in 2010, and persons B and C, who are current employees of the university. And it is correct to say that in the course of her work in the expenses section, person A did identify improvements that could be made to the process of claiming expenses, particularly around sign-off authority and clarity around the allowable, what are allowable expenses and what are not.
Professor, can I say that you're using very muted language to describe what happened? As I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, person A, hard as they tried, found it almost impossible to get management to take responsibility or to sign off on what person A regarded as fraudulent expense claims. And the detail of it is really quite astonishing. I mean, an allegation that mileage expenses were misused repeatedly to pay for work done in the university. Allegations around massive payments for academic staff to go as far away as Sydney, an attempt by staff to charge to the university and the taxpayer expenses for their spouses, use of expense accounts to perhaps bypass procurement rules and guidelines in the purchase of PC equipment, and I could go on, and all the while person A, exercising due diligence and operating in accordance with their responsibilities, hit a brick wall when dealing with management. I put it to you, Professor, that this is much more in the experience of Person A than simply finding systems deficiencies or areas where improvements were necessary. I want to put it to you that Person A, in fact, stumbled across a system that was arbitrary and a system that displayed favouritism and a system that completely went against the grain and broke your own rules according to the status of the person making the claim.
Well, the first thing I would say that in the context of, I think, 7 expense claims that Person A brought to the attention of the university and later to the attention of this committee in 2012. If you want to consider the detail of any of those, I will ask the Director of Finance to deal with the detail of any one of those or any number of those expense claims that you wish to get more detail on. But in terms of what you're really getting at here is the attitude of the university towards Person A.
Well, I am in part, and I want your view on that. But initially, I have given a sample of the complaints that were raised by Person A. You're not disputing the fact that Person A brought forward these complaints?
I am not disputing the fact that in the course of her work, Person A identified those claims.
Okay, so that's part one. Part two, that Person A reported that she was being blanked and perhaps even left to hang out to dry by supervisory management in respect of these expense claims.
I'm not disputing the fact that is what she felt, but I also want to draw your attention to the fact that when a system of process improvement was being planned in the finance department, Person A was a key member of the team who brought about the new expenses policy and process that was introduced at the end of 2010.
And
she was not ignored or blanked. She was a key member of the drive by the university to improve its
well, then explain to me then, Professor, why Person A no longer works for the university.
Well, because Person A went on sick leave in July 2010, and in 2012, as I detail in the briefing paper, she requested the university to facilitate her early retirement from.
And was Person A's sick leave and matters as they subsequently unfolded, were they connected with Person A coming forward and making the complaint and all of that?
I do have a certain difficulty in discussing in detail the personal circumstances of a former employee of the university, and I may.
I don't, so maybe I'll make it straightforward for you, because you actually referred to Person A in your own briefing document.
Yes.
So you are quite at liberty to discuss this case, and it's important that you do. Because my understanding is that Person A stumbled across the abuse of the expenses system repeatedly. You've mentioned 7 instances that were subsequently examined in the university and subsequently in the Mazars report. But in fact, my understanding is that Person A identified many other breaches. My understanding is that Person A was stonewalled and in fact leaned on by management in your university for having the temerity to come forward and insist that the rules be followed. My understanding is that Person A got sick directly as a consequence of all of that. My understanding is that when Person A was on leave, that the HR function of your university did not cover itself in glory, far from it. My understanding, in other words, Professor Barry, is that not alone was there fiddling of the system going on for selected individuals, I understand, but in fact, the very person and people who brought this to the attention of the university were punished. And in the case of person A, that punishment has meant that that person no longer works for the university. That's my summation of what happened. We'll get to the control changes that you made, if you wish, later in the meeting. But it's very important that we understand exactly what happened in this turn of events and why a person who you say was critical to the changes in 2010 was kicked to the curb and no longer works for your university.
Well, your understanding and my understanding would be a miles apart on this issue.
Share with me on those elements your understanding, Professor, please.
Well, I know more about person A than you do, but I am very reluctant in a public forum to share the detail that I know, which is quite personal information around a former employee of the university, and I'm simply not prepared to do it.
Well, tell us about her complaints on, because I think this is a diversionary tactic. I'm not asking you to describe the nature of person A's sickness, if that's what concerns you. But I do want you to tell us about person A and the turn of events when person A discovers, holy hour, what is going on here? And they go to their management for direction. They get knocked back. They knock back certain expense claims only for more senior people to intervene and say, no, that's okay, put that through. I want you to talk to me about your understanding. Did that not happen, Professor?
Well, my understanding is that all the claims in question were appropriately dealt with and appropriately approved.
Really? Well, your own submission and the Mazars report and the position of the Higher Education Authority, if I understand them correctly, actually contradicts that.
Where?
Well, the very fact that you introduced changes, let's see, shall we? You had to settle with revenue, didn't you?
Yes.
As a result, as a consequence. Okay, so tell us about the settlement with revenue. What was that about?
I'll ask the Director of Finance to talk about
I prefer if you did, Professor. You're the boss.
But
No offence, Mr. Field.
My understanding is that we had a policy on sabbatical and associated expenses, which the CNAG raised questions about that policy, and that we engaged on the advice of the CNAG with revenue and made a disclosure to revenue as to how we were dealing with expense claims, the policy we had for dealing with expense claims, and in that context...
How much did you have to make a settlement with revenue?
We did.
How much?
In relation to the sabbaticals, what we conducted...
I just need a figure, Mr. Field.
186,000.
186,000.
Is related to a 4-year period.
In relation to a 4-year period. And was one of the cases bound up in this settlement, the one that I referred to, which was a travel arrangement whilst a person was on sabbatical leave. It was heading over to Sydney. The expense claim was initially, as I understand, about €4,500. It was for a couple, in other words, the staff member plus their spouse. That got knocked back, but a different arrangement came into place, and an expense was cleared of €15,000 on the basis of a per diem rate. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, so in relation to how sabbaticals worked in the period between 2008 and 2012, which is the period covered by the submission that we made to the revenue, when individuals would be approved to go on sabbatical leave, there would be an amount of expenses agreed to be paid for them.
Certainly.
As part of that. The process that we had in place at that time was this was paid as a round sum amount, and it was paid monthly to the person while they were away. The issue that was raised, it was raised by the CNAG with us, was whether this was compliant with taxation rules, and the revenue in and around that time, 2011-2012, had published a policy paper on the payment of round sum
Okay, and
expenses.
in this case, Mr. Field, sorry to go across, your time is limited to us. In this case, I am advised that initially this claim, person A was advised knock that back, it doesn't comply. That advice was given by two managers. Not least because the claimant in question was to retire shortly around that time. And then, subsequently, a direction came from further on high. Are you the financial controller for the university?
No, not the financial controller, the director of finance.
Okay, what's your relationship to the financial controller?
The financial controller would have worked for me, yes.
Right. Well, it seems that the direction might have come from the financial controller.
Yeah, so
For
if I
15
could just...
grand. Now, I'm labouring this particular. There's other instances, and we don't have the scope go here. Look, and don't worry, I'm not proposing to go into each of them. Person A brought this forward. So person A was right, weren't they?
So if I could just clarify the process that happened in relation to that, because I would have reviewed that when the allegation was raised in 2012. So there's two expense claims referenced in that allegation. Allegation B, it's referred to by person A. The first expense claim is the one, as you've outlined, that she outlined in relation to flights to Sydney.
Yeah.
And that expense claim was rejected at the time. The person was going on sabbatical, and in line with all the other people who went on sabbatical at that time, the calculation of the expenses payable, as I mentioned already, Deputy, round sum amounts were calculated and paid to the individual as part of the second claim. The second claim, when we reviewed it in 2012 as part of the review of the allegations, was appropriately approved, and the evidence was available on the claim that it had been appropriately approved.
So this was all kosher. There was nothing wrong with this claim.
And the evidence that we could see on the claim when we reviewed it in 2012 indicated that it had been approved and signed.
Of course it had been. Of course it had been approved. I'm not disputing that. We know it had been approved.
I thought you were okay.
But what I'm questioning is the. No, I know that the 15 grand claim was approved.
Yes.
What I'm querying here is not the fact that these matters were approved.
Yeah.
What I'm saying to you is that person A, the professor has asserted that person A identified matters that required improvement.
Yeah,
Minor issues. That's not a minor issue. It's not a minor issue that, according to person A, that there was messing going on, that there was interference from high-level management to lean on staff within the university to award expenses that were not valid. That's in a nutshell really what happened.
Yeah, but just to clarify that our review and the review by Mazars has found that there were not payments made that were inappropriate. So,
Well,
we'll
come to Mazards
just
in a
like
moment.
in terms of person A's role was to review expenses and ensure they complied with policy.
Correct.
So there's a number of the expenses where she has indicated in her allegations that she raised issues with them, and the evidence when we reviewed it pointed to the fact that a number of those claims
So
were
person
not.
A was just wrong, was she?
No, I didn't. She was actually right. Yeah. So when she raised issues with certain claims and they were not paid. Now she raised issues with other claims. So there's two claims in her allegations that were not paid at all. That's
Which the one on spa treatments, was it?
Yes.
I accept that wasn't good. Well, I swear to God, if that had been paid, that would seriously set Limerick alight, I would imagine. The chattering classes.
Yeah, so
getting
allegations.
Spa treatments paid for by the taxpayer.
Yeah, so it was not paid as appropriate. And allegation A was not paid through expenses. That one was not paid. And I think the point that Professor Barry was making was that in relation to the other payments that were made, it was appropriate to pay them. That was what we found. However,
Who carried out your internal review? So person A, and we'll get to B and C later on, I'm assuming. So person A came forward, just bear with me on this line of question. But person A came forward, the allegations were made, 7, let's stick to the 7, there were more. You had your own internal inquiry, obviously an assessment.
Yeah.
Who headed that up?
I carried that out.
You carried that out, and who who helped you with that? Was it just you, Mr. Field? Or?
Well, I led
Your
the
financial
process,
controller.
and the financial controller would have been involved in terms of recovering records related to the
So
claims.
you examined yourselves?
Well, I don't have a day-to-day involvement in terms of the
No,
approval of expenses.
I'm just trying to establish the facts. The university examined itself in relation to all of these.
So, well, in the matters were raised through the PSC, so they were raised with the CNAG as well. So I had interaction with the CNAG in relation to the review of them as well. So,
What was the interaction with the CNAG? What did that consist?
So when Person A's allegations were referred to this committee in 2012, and this committee referred them to the CNAG for follow-up, and then I received correspondence with the allegations from the CNAG's office. They asked me.
And how did you interact with the CNAG? By letter?
Yes, so
did the CNAG pay you a visit?
Well, they would have been conducting audits. They didn't do a specific investigation
into these matters.
They visit us.
No, I accept that, but there wasn't a detailed hands-on engagement by the CNAG. Mazars then afterwards, just rolling the tape forward, come in and they're appointed by the Higher Education Authority. I'm correct in saying that?
Yes.
To carry out a review. But what's curious here is that the review is of the process by which you carried out your own investigation. I want to put it to the HEA, but also to yourselves. I would have been a lot happier if an independent outside agency had actually been simply establishing that you should have. So the financial controller, this is the position who was running things when these controversies arose, exited the employment of University of Limerick, received a severance payment. What was the order of the severance payment? Are you in a position to tell us?
It's disclosed in our 2012 accounts.
Disclose it again, please.
It was 200. The exact number I don't know, but it was in the region of 220,000, 230,000.
Okay, so 220 to 230,000 euro. And then this same person re-enters and now still operates or works in a consultancy capacity.
For a period of time, not still.
Not still. How long was that person working in a consultancy capacity?
For 3 years.
Okay, so for those 3 years, from what date to what date?
Well, it was 2012 that so it would be sometime 2012 to mid-2013.
Okay, thank you for helping me with my mathematics. I can add, Okay, so let's compare and contrast then the experiences of that. So person A comes forward, gets sick.
One question.
Yeah. Sequence out what happened next and what happened next. And I'm struck by the contrast because obviously the financial controller was in, I presume, was the direct line manager for these staff, yeah? For A, B, and C.
No.
No.
Not the direct.
Who was then?
So there would be a person overseeing the operation of the expenses office.
Okay, so
and
there was
then there would be a financial accountant.
Okay, so what would the financial controller's role have been? What would their interaction with A, B or C have been?
Well, it would be limited enough interaction. They wouldn't, I
would have thought the financial controller, ultimately, notwithstanding a layer in between, is the person in charge. They're the authority.
Yeah, they're the boss, I suppose, for the want of a better word of the department.
The boss winds up exiting with a severance, a very, very generous severance package. The whistleblower ends up unwell and not working for the university. The other two whistleblowers are engaged in a protracted, as the Cathaoirleach has pointed out, process and dispute with the university and with the department. You know, this is just really very, very troubling stuff. Yeah, I would like at some stage you to explain to us in a bit more detail the settlement you made with Revenue in respect of the sabbatical policy. What was that all about? I mean, were you making a habit of paying for people's spouses, their travel, their accommodation? How did that bill work up? Was it a liability in terms of benefit in kind? I'd just like more information on that, please.
That you were in the Institute for a long number of years, given that we had information that was brought to your attention by what has been characterised as whistleblowers, given that there was an internal review and then an external review, and everything that you've seen since then, would it be your position that there was abuse of the expenses system in your organisation?
No.
Okay. Would you be of the view that there was any wrongdoing in people claiming expenses by any individuals in your organisation?
I do think that individuals made claims which were not in accordance with policy, and there are many reasons why that can happen, including lack of awareness of the rules of the expense, of what are and are not allowable expenses. And part of the improvements we made in the expenses regime, for the want of a better term, in 2010 was to make it crystal clear what claims were allowable and what claims were not.
Are you aware of the statement that ignorance is no defence in law? So simply because somebody may claim that they were unaware of rules, what I'm saying is that, is it your view, either yes or no, that there was any wrongdoing by individuals in your organisation in relation to claiming expenses? Because I'm hearing you talking around some of these issues, but I'm not hearing you being any way direct. Because if an organisation is to learn lessons, the first thing an organisation has to do is accept there was failures. So if I can put it again, do you believe there was any wrongdoing by any individual or individuals in relation to claiming expenses?
No is the answer to your question. I don't believe that there was wrongdoing by an individual or individuals, but I think that we had processes in place which were not performing an adequate function. So if you regard that as wrongdoing, then I'm the president. I take responsibility
but
for
my understanding of wrongdoing may be different to yours. So what I'm hearing from you is that you don't believe there was any abuse of the system. You don't believe there was any intentional wrongdoing by anybody. If there was any wrongdoing, it was because they unintentionally did not understand the processes or the rules. That's what I'm hearing from you. You certainly then would not agree that there was any level of corruption, even with a small c, or fiddling of expenses. So for all of what has been disclosed to you and to us, you simply don't accept any wrongdoing by anybody other than process failures. Would that be a fair summation of your position?
Well, I would certainly reject any statement that there was corruption going on in the University of Limerick in the strongest possible terms.
And reject that, but when I was asking you a question, so you're entitled to reject it. What I'm saying is that you reject that there was any level of corruption. You reject there was any level of personal wrongdoing by individuals intentionally or maliciously, to use that word that you use in a different context. You reject there was any abuse. So do you accept then that there was financial control failures?
Yes.
Do you accept that there was control lapses?
Yes.
And who is responsible then for failures in control and system failures and control lapses? Who will be responsible for that?
Well, I am responsible for everything that happens in the University of Limerick. I am the Chief Accounting Officer of the University of Limerick.
So do you take responsibility? Do you take personal responsibility for these control lapses, and which you say you do acknowledge were in place, and the financial control system lapses or failures? Do you take personal responsibility for those failures?
Yes, I do.
And Mr. Field?
Vindication for a whistleblower can take years. Fiona O'Callaghan was responsible for verifying expense claims at the University of Limerick. In 2012, she raised concerns about the level and type of expenses being claimed by some staff members.
For the first couple of years, I was getting nowhere. I felt very much on my own. They rely on silence. They rely on the inability of people to risk their jobs and risk their careers in moving forward. And then when you take that away, actually, then they don't know, that the only way you can take it away is through media. And then the fear is transferred onto them. Then suddenly they're afraid.
Leona's concerns included payments made to some staff to cover the mileage costs between their homes and the university, and tax-free allowances paid to an academic on sabbatical on the other side of the world. But it would be 5 years before Leona was finally vindicated.
There was a lot of rumours. They were saying that I was imagining that there was all sorts of conspiracies going on in the university, and that it was coming from a very unwell place.
Leona made a submission to the Dáil Public Accounts Committee about the various payments. The university later told the PAC that sabbatical payments alone resulted in a 6-figure settlement with the Revenue Commissioners. An external report by experts was extremely critical of the university's HR practices, corporate governance, and financial practices. The report found there was adequate evidence for Leona to question some payments at the university, and that these were ultimately corrected.
There was a lot of power, and I was just an administrator within the university, and I was on my own. For a long time, it felt as though I was the person in the wrong.
In this program The whistleblowers featured in this program have been vindicated since they made their protective disclosures. So, with their good names intact, how has the experience affected their careers? 10 years on from her disclosure, Irish nationwide whistleblower Olivia Green has yet to secure a job in financial services.
Career suicide would apply to my situation, as it was impossible to get employment within financial services. I wasn't part of that gang anymore. I wasn't welcome to the gang because I had blown the whistle. So I presume they obviously saw me as a threat.
That's the reality you're facing with. So if somebody is there and they've outed other people's secrets, then are you going to want them working for you? If the secrets are that big that media would be interested in everything else, I think they should be questioning themselves.
I mean, there's a real paradox going on where we celebrate whistleblowers, we want them to come forward, organisations, governments talk about new ways of helping whistleblowers, and then when they actually do, there's very little to support, and this is a real problem.
While legislation now provides some level of protection for people making protected disclosures, it's clear that many whistleblowers continue to pay a high price when trying to expose uncomfortable truths. But for some whistleblowers, the obligation they feel to call out wrongdoing is just part of their DNA.
I've asked myself many a time, would I do it again, or did I regret doing it in the first place? And yes, if I had to do it again, I would do it again.
I don't think I would have done anything differently. I couldn't do anything differently because I am just the way I am.
If there's wrong things done, it should be spoken about. I was just really glad I did it.
In coming out and speaking openly and making the protected disclosure, I had already kind of lost a lot. Did I continue to lose more? Probably, but no, I have no regrets. I genuinely have no regrets.
Now we're going to look at the University of Limerick, where we found problems with procurement, ethics, and blatant evidence that the department had been misled. We already know universities treasure their autonomy, and each year they self-declare in their financial statements that they abide by things like spending rules, salary caps, ethics laws, and procurement regulations. And even though the University of Limerick was criticised by the Public Accounts Committee for some failures in its expenses regime, it was adamant it could manage itself.
We are not going to sit here and be pilloried as if we were useless until someone came along and told us what to do. We have always operated to the highest possible standards.
We looked at the body with ultimate responsibility for ensuring the university adhered to the highest possible standards, its governing authority.
The governing body will be overall responsible for the running of the university, and in particular for financial management, estate management, and so forth.
In fact, in each year's accounts, the governing authority makes a statement that as a group, it ensures the university complies with things like government pay policy, codes of conduct, and procurement rules. But how does that work out? Well, for instance, universities are bound by very strict rules on pay, but we found they can legally set up a subsidiary company that can pay its employees what it likes. One such company is Unijobs DAC, where a long-time member of UL's own governing authority was hired as its CEO for €125,000 a year, €13,000 above the top of UL's salary cap. UL and Unijobs said this was legal as he was an employee of a subsidiary, not the university, so was not bound by public pay scales. And what about ethics? Members of governing authorities occupy important roles, so much so that, like politicians, they have to declare conflicts of interest.
The standard of registration is set quite low. All that's required is that an interest could influence the way in which a function is discharged. Not that it would influence, not that it will influence, not that it will certainly. It's simply enough that there's a possibility that it could influence the way in which a member of a governing authority discharges their functions.
To test this, let's look at John Field, one of the people who signed the statement of compliance on behalf of the governing authority. But what about the case of his brother's company, Maverick Communications International Limited, which he had a small shareholding in? UL's business relationship with Maverick began before Mr. Field joined the university in 2009. In the last 7 years, Maverick competed for tenders and sold more than €200,000 worth of business to UL. In an email to a UL staff member, Maverick's owner did disclose his connection during the procurement process. However, John Field himself did not declare his interest, even though it was he who was bound to do so, under various different laws and codes that govern this type of conflict. Even though the tenders were approved by Mr. Field's department, UL said he was not directly involved in the contract, and members are not obliged to declare an interest that would not materially influence them.
The legislation doesn't say if, in the opinion of the member of the governing authority, it wouldn't influence them. The legislation is objectively framed. It simply says that if the interest could materially influence them, and the standard, as said, is set quite low.
And what about procurement? The governing authority also states that the goods it buys are tendered for properly.
Every public body that is spending public money must go to tender for those works, services or goods. No exceptions. Over €25,000, every tender in Ireland must be advertised on the government's portal.
There was no tender advertised after the governing authority decided to bring in a new long service awards policy in 2012. UL's HR director Tommy Foy contacted 3 shops to get quotes for 300 engraved cross pens and 130 engraved Belova watches. The lowest price quoted was €69,800, and a couple of months later, Mr. Foy went back to the same shop on behalf of UL to buy €42,000 worth of customised silver medallions for retirees. That is more than €110,000 worth of business to one small shop, and the jeweller, Ty Carney Jewellers, which is owned by a member of UL's own governing authority, Ty Carney. Mr. Carney had not made any declaration of interest. He said he was not at the governing authority meeting that decided on the new awards policy, and when he asked UL afterwards, he was told he did not need to declare. In a statement he said, "I was advised that no such obligation existed, as I had taken no hand act or part in any decision of the university in respect of this contract, and, as a result, could not possibly have been materially influenced in the performance of my functions." UL said given time constraints of a one-off purchase, procurement was limited, but that the company belonging to a member of its governing authority was the best value for money. Separately, the governing authority has been instrumental in defending UL from calls for a wider inquiry into allegations made by 3 whistleblowers who took their case to the very top.
I thought they were very genuine people making a case that they wanted to have investigated. I welcome whistleblowers coming forward, and I was very impressed with the individuals concerned.
2 whistleblowers have been suspended for 2 years. A third whistleblower had previously left UL and came out in support of the women.
The first time I started to have difficulty was when I started to look at how inconsistent the expenses were from one person to another, from one department to another. They were very, very strict for some departments, extremely strict. And then in other departments, there just didn't seem to be any limit.
Miss O'Callaghan raised concerns within UL in 2011. She later contacted the PAC, and as a result, UL had to make a six-figure settlement with the revenue commissioners.
Person A was a key member of the team who brought about the new expenses policy and the process that was introduced.
Yet UL felt she should not return to work and offered her a severance deal, provided she sign a confidentiality agreement.
There was no Whistleblowers Act, there was no protected disclosures or anything like that, not that I knew of. So I signed the confidentiality agreement that stopped me from being able to talk about expenses. And I walked away with 6 months out of my salary, is what I walked away with, that was it. And I had to give up my full-time pensionable position.
Then, 3 years later, the woman who replaced her and another colleague made similar allegations. They have asked that we protect their identities.
In order for it to do my job, I had to follow policy and procedure, but when I came to question it, it was almost made feel like I shouldn't be questioning them, that I should be paying them without even questioning them. All I did was highlighted stuff in accordance with their policy, and I felt like I was the one that was being the troublemaker the whole time.
After these two women contacted the HEA to make protected disclosures, UL hired a consultant to conduct an inquiry. The author concluded the two whistleblowers had acted with malicious intent. UL suspended both women pending disciplinary hearings.
We are not alleging that B&C are malicious. What I have told you is that an external investigation upheld by an external appeal has come to that conclusion.
I cried actually for ages after watching it. I just felt, it was really hurtful because it's so far from the truth. Like, they know, they have that report and they know that report is a whitewash.
I do not believe that we have had a comprehensive or fully frank account of what has happened, what has been revealed by whistleblowers, in terms of how those whistleblowers' disclosures have been processed and managed, how those individuals have been treated.
There were common themes to the whistleblowers' complaints, in particular the authorization of spending at the Human Resources Department. We looked for evidence to substantiate their concerns. One significant item of spending came to our attention, an online doctorate two senior managers of the department got from a private college in America.
Dr. Tommy Foy.
The two recipients were Tommy Foy, the director of HR, and Pat Rocket,
Dr. Patrick Rocket,
who, along with being a HR manager, is also a member of the governing authority. UL paid almost $100,000 for their studies and even paid their flights and hotels to attend a hooding ceremony in Florida. And in Mr. Foy's case, we found documents approving UL's spend on his tuition fees that were approved by himself.
It was like as if they're a god unto themselves, so they get to make their own decisions and nobody holds them accountable.
As the HEA began an inquiry into the cases of all three women, their story hit the front page of the Limerick Leader. UL issued legal proceedings against the newspaper and personally against its editor, Alan English.
For the Limerick Leader to go to the High Court on this matter could potentially have cost hundreds of thousands. I was personally sued. I don't have the means to fight UL in the High Court when they're being backed by the public purse. I think the intention of the High Court action against the leader itself and against me personally was to intimidate, was to basically ensure that we backed away from the story. But I'm proud to say that we didn't.
The case was only dropped after the HEA intervened and said an attempt by UL to sue for defamation was a misuse of public funds. A limited HEA review into UL's handling of the whistleblowers was published in 2016. But UL's institutional independence meant it was not able to dig deep.
Maybe in retrospect we should have looked at a wider review, but that was the basis of the decision at the time.
Still, the report found numerous flaws with UL's HR procedures in how it dealt with the three women, and afterwards the HEA said it still had concerns there may be a culture of inappropriate expense claims.
I feel as though myself and the others have kind of come up and you feel as if you're against an institution. Unless the culture changes, there'll be many more of me.
But 3 weeks ago, the University of Limerick suddenly changed its approach. A new president, Professor Des Fitzgerald, took over from Don Barry, and on day one he agreed to an independent inquiry into the expenses row and a number of other issues at the university. The dramatic shift in UL's position came just days after the RTE Investigations Unit sent its governing authority detailed correspondence setting out what we had uncovered. Among various issues, we had found particular problems with 2 lump sum severance packages that had been paid to senior staff. These payments were made to UL's former financial controller, John Fox, and its former director of lifelong learning, Dermot Collin. The severance deals will now form part of the newly announced inquiry. And tonight, we can reveal what it was about them that provoked such concern. Once again, the PAC had asked the questions, but it did not get the answers.
That identified that we had followed good practice in relation to the severance, except for it identified one issue where we hadn't complied with good practice.
Okay, and what was that particular? Where was it that you hadn't?
The prior approval of the Department of Education.
Okay.
In fact, the CNAG investigation also said the payments were well in excess of the standard public sector severance rate. Mr. Fox should have got €120,000. He got almost twice that. Mr. Collin should have got €165,000. He got a third more. The fact that they were excessive was only half the story. UL's HR director Tommy Foy told the department the deals were extremely beneficial as there were performance issues and employment relationships had broken down. A report by the Secretary General of the department said it was told by UL they were good value based on legal advice and avoided potential dismissal. However, before they left UL, both men had set up consultancy companies and had been immediately hired back for 3 years' work. We contacted both men and they rejected UL's claims in the strongest possible terms. They both said they were very surprised by what we brought to their attention and had never been the subject of a disciplinary action. We simultaneously contacted UL. It admitted that despite what the department had been told, it did not want to lose the men. In fact, they did not leave at all. They were offered the consultancy contracts as part of the severance packages. It all meant that in Mr. Fox's case, after his €232,000 severance deal, he was paid a nearly identical amount for his consultancy work. In Mr. Collin's case, after a €220,000 severance deal, he received nearly an identical amount for his consultancy work. The contracts had not gone through proper procurement. They had been kept quiet from the department, and their very existence exposed UL's attempt to deliberately mislead the CNAG. We wrote to University of Limerick's HR director Tommy Foy. He did not respond. We put it to UL that it had deliberately misled the department. It said as an independent inquiry was now underway, it would not be appropriate to comment. UL also said it had initiated a broad review of its senior management structures and had secured sanction to begin recruiting a number of new senior roles. It said its new president had also initiated reviews of its corporate governance systems. As our investigation directly related to the evidence given at the Public Accounts Committee, we invited its members to view our findings.
I actually feel really angry. I feel cheated by the responses that we got from many of the people who appeared at the Public Accounts Committee.
The Public Accounts Committee will be taking legal advice to see how strongly our powers are in relation to dealing with these matters, and in particular this idea that people can come and not provide full information when they're asked questions. The public won't tolerate that, the Oireachtas won't tolerate that, and the Public Accounts Committee won't tolerate that.
What I've just watched is frightening, shocking and unacceptable, and it strikes me that after all of the scandals in the various institutions, we're still reliant on Primetime. the limited questioning that we can do on a Public Accounts Committee, and the underfunded Controller and Auditor General's office to highlight some of the issues. And this is from a sector that came crying to the government that they have no money, which led to the Castles report with strong recommendations that we bring in fees for students or loans for students.
I'm very shocked to hear of a manoeuvre to deliberately mislead the Comptroller and Auditor General. That is absolutely outrageous. I'm also concerned that in respect of the HEA and the department that they're asleep at the wheel, quite frankly. It's very clear that we've only begun to scratch the surface of all of these matters. But the bottom line is this: people coming before the Public Accounts Committee need to understand they come to give truthful and complete evidence. And anything short of that is a deliberate tactic to mislead and to evade. And that is not acceptable.
There needs to be consequences, or you won't change behaviour. And I think when you see things like, for example, a small local newspaper, which is where the editor is personally put at risk, I think it's deeply disturbing.
The almost willful misdirection of certain accounting officers in regards to questions, repeated questions that they failed to answer or did not answer accurately at the Public Accounts Committee is particularly worrying.
This has to be a game changer for us who are currently in the Public Accounts Committee. Those that come to defend institutions and do not provide the full truth as to what is there. What is the consequence to them? And I think that's a question that we really need to think about.
There are clear questions here for the HEA, there's clear questions for the department and for all of those accounting officers. And there is very little accountability in relation to management of conflicts of interest, in relation to how taxpayers' money, hard-earned money, is spent, and also in relation to the treatment of whistleblowers. And the light touch regulation that we have in the higher education sector has led to many of these problems, and it's unacceptable.
We're utterly dependent on whistleblowers to come forward, and they've contacted each and every one of us in desperation, and yet they